So, welcome to this evening's seminar. I've called it The Color Turquoise, which is a reference to both David Icke and Alice Walker, because both of them will come up over the course of this talk. If you are British, you will probably have a very different idea of who David Icke is. If you are American, you will again, think of him in a very different way. I think this is possibly the most apposite quote we can possibly imagine, really, for this. I found this earlier today while I was flipping through looking for a reference I'd found, and I thought, you know, there is literally nothing that encapsulates this discourse better than this. So, what do I mean when I talk about the color turquoise? Okay, well, I think we start with the color purple, really. In December 2018, Alice Walker was invited by the New York Times to do one of those little puff pieces that they quality newspapers have in their review section, where they're invited to say, what books are on your bedside table? What books are you reading at the moment? What books would you recommend? And in the question, what books are on your bedside table? Alice Walker, the legendary writer of The Color Purple, included a bunch of books, and she wrote The Road of Lost Innocence, which is by Somali Mama, about child selling, enslavement, and sadistic sex trafficking in Cambodia. And then the second thing she said was, And the Truth Shall Set You Free, by David Icke. And she just says, in Icke's books, there is the whole of existence on this planet and several others to think about. A curious person's dream come true. And, you know, the New York Times, the format of these little puff pieces, I mean, you know, you can imagine it's on a Saturday, you pick up the paper, it's just in the corner, you just sort of browse it in between the actual book reviews and the news and that sort of thing. And so there's not really a chance for the paper to editorialize on the fact that, as was said in the Jewish publication The Tablet, the New York Times just published an unqualified recommendation for an insanely anti-Semitic book. The book recommended by author Alice Walker, writes E.A. Rosenberg, the author, repeatedly cites the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and dubs the Talmuds among the most appallingly racist documents on the planet, and says that Jews funded the Holocaust and control the KKK. David Icke and Alice Walker, in fact, both strongly deny that the book is anti-Semitic. In fact, Walker has repeatedly gone on the record to both support David Icke and to talk against the idea that he might be an anti-Semite. But Rosenberg, who wrote the article, got so sick of this defense that basically says, come for David Icke's insane anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in the book and stay for his recommender Alice Walker's own absolutely unhinged poem about the evils of the Talmud, which she apparently learned about from YouTube. No, really, she actually says that, and she does say that, and we're going to look at that a bit later. To those asking why I never mentioned David Icke believes the world is controlled by reptilian aliens, it was deliberate. Icke uses reptilians as a lazy code for Jews to evade claims of anti-Semitism, avoid scrutiny, and pose as a harmless fringe crank. I chose not to fall for it. That is, what Rosenberg is saying is that David Icke couldn't possibly believe that reptilian aliens control the planets, let alone that the protocols of the Elders of Zion is really about reptiles. He's just using reptilians in order to escape the charge of being an anti-Semite. It's all pretend. We're going to talk a bit about that later on, but we need some context now. Okay, so let's talk about where David Icke came from and why he might be known for different things if you're in the UK and if, like me, you're of a certain age. Okay, so this is what David Icke was doing in 1982.
In just under 10 minutes, Terry Wogan presents a special Christmas edition of Blankety Blank. That's after final score with David Icke.
Good evening. Liverpool stay 5 points clear in Division 1. Kenny Dalglish gets a hat-trick in their 5-2 win over Manchester City. Justin Fashanu scores his first goal for Notts County, but Newcastle's Kevin Keegan misses a penalty in his first match for 6 weeks. 8 players are sent off today. Racing, John Frankham rides Wayward Lad to victory in the big race of the day, the King George VI Chase at Kempton. Now we start with the classified football results.
League Division 1.
That's quite the time capsule of what sports reporting looked like in 1982. Yeah, David Icke was the sports guy on the telly on BBC One in that era when there were in fact only 3 channels. On one of the channels, the most watched channel, David Icke reported on the football, the racing, the snooker, and the athletics as well. And in fact, before being on the telly, David Icke was actually David Icke was actually a professional footballer. Here's David Icke, aged about 20, in the colours of Hereford City, who he played for until 1973, where at the age of about 21, he discovered that he had arthritis, and although he was in good shape, he was in too much pain to be a goalkeeper anymore. His football career in tatters, he went into journalism. And he worked his way up. He was in local journalism in the provinces in England, in Leicester, in fact. And he got into local radio and then local television, and he was seen by the BBC in London, who decided that he was someone who they would want presenting the football on national television. So that's how I knew David Icke. But around the time that he was reading out the final scores, like in that report just then, he was also getting into the New Age. He was also getting into healing and alternative therapies and stuff because of his muscular pain. And he became very deeply into alternative therapy. He moved directly from the New Age movement to being one of the spokesmen, and indeed by the mid-80s, the leaders of the British Green Party. Here he is in his mid-30s as the main spokesman for the Green Party, which in the mid-80s was getting its first rise in popularity. And although famous, although people, as he said, would greet him in the street and shake his hand, people would go, "Oh, you're David Icke off the telly." Although, you know, he was well liked. Around 1989 and 1990, a couple of things happened. Now, he also wrote some books as a journalist. And in 1983, he wrote a game called "It's a Tough Game, Son." Wrote a book called "It's a Tough Game, Son," which is about how to get into football if you're a kid. In 1989, he wrote a book about green politics, which is called "It Doesn't Have to Be Like This." And it's around 1989 that things started to go a bit wrong for David Icke. He began to feel a sense of personal despair. He began to feel that something was very wrong. And he started hearing voices and having visions. And his friends in the New Age movement told him he was a prophet And as a result, he wrote a book called Truth Vibrations. And I have a copy of Truth Vibrations, and so we're going to look at Truth Vibrations in a bit. And this is my copy. You can see the post-it note where I wanted to like pick on something for this talk. It's about this time that two things happen. One thing is that he made a political stand against the Conservative government, where he basically said he'd be willing to go to jail rather than pay the poll tax. The poll tax was a hugely unpopular tax that Margaret Thatcher's government attempted to implement, and for a couple of years it was hugely contested, and eventually it was scrapped because everybody hated it and it was an election loser. But he said he'd be willing to go to jail rather than pay the poll tax, and the BBC fired him. And the second thing that happened was that in order to promote the Truth Vibrations, he appeared on a primetime television chat show alongside legendary broadcaster Terry Wogan. Now, Terry Wogan was for decades, and I mean decades, Mr. Light Entertainment. He's the, you know, the Eurovision commentator. He's like, he did like in his last few years of his life, he had a morning radio show nationally. He, from the early 80s to the early 90s, he had a hugely influential chat show. If you're American, and I know there's at least one American here, consider it as being equivalent in popularity to something like Letterman. Okay, it's huge, right? It was huge. You know, everybody watched Wogan, and okay, so he appears on Wogan. And it was broadcast live.
Because the key thing to get over, Terry, is this. When we think, it is not a vacuum. When we think, we create an energy field. This is how telepathy works. An energy field leaves one being, and other beings can tune into it and read that thought. When you think thoughts of love and wisdom and of tolerance and all the things we wish to bring to the earth, you create a certain kind of thought energy, the very same energy that the Godhead sends around creation. When you think the other thoughts of hatred, of anger, of aggression, you create a different kind of energy known as negativity, which is very destructive. This being called Lucifer lives off this energy. So the more that is produced on this planet, the more powerful that being becomes. Therefore, he stimulates and has stimulated this planet over 12,000 years since he's been in control to produce as much of this energy as possible.
So evil has been in control of the planet for 12,000 years?
It has been the dominating force. Evil's not the right word, it is imbalance. But it has been increasingly in control. As I repeat, survey the world, ladies and gentlemen. Is the force of love in control of this world, guiding this planet at this time? Of course not. The negativity, the thoughts that I'm talking about that are very destructive, are pouring out of this planet
let me
every day.
Was it a great shock for you to discover this at 38?
Well, I think the word is gobsmacked. But again, you know, the best way of removing negativity is to laugh and be joyous. So I'm delighted that there's so much laughter in the audience tonight.
But no,
but just let me say this.
They're laughing at you. They're not laughing with you.
Fine.
I didn't mean that to be hurtful.
Terry.
I don't want you to misinterpret it. They're not laughing in sympathy with you.
No, let me say two things to that. First of all, if anyone believes, after 12,000 years of this truth being lost and forgotten, that coming out with it initially is going to get any kind of reaction other than that one or condemnation, then I would be a crackpot if I thought that was the case. The other thing is, there is this great illusion, you know, that Jesus was born and stood up and said, I know who I am. It was revealed to him in stages. He was very, very close to beginning the mission which is described in the Bible, but not described brilliantly accurately, before he knew who he was. And when he came out, Terry, and said, I am the Son of God, I am an aspect of the soul of the Godhead incarnate because of things that need to be done on this planet urgently, people laughed, people ridiculed. And in the end, you know, they crucified him.
In the end, they crucified him. Yeah, so this, you have to have the context of the fact that it's 7:10 in the evening on a Monday. I know where I was. I know where I was sitting. I know where my mum was, who was watching it and nodding away because she agreed with everything he said. 13 million people watched this, I think. Like something like a quarter of the population of the United Kingdom back then, give or take, right, watched David Icke being laughed at and watched Terry Wogan going, yeah, they're not laughing with you, David, they're laughing at you. But you have to realize that the David Icke that we're looking at here is not the David Icke who is known as the anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist by journalists like Yair Rosenberg. Now, this is a very different David Icke, but this is also the basis of where he comes from. This is the basis of who he is. So around the time he started having visions and hearing voices, he got under the sway of a medium called Betty Shine. And Betty Shine was a spiritual healer who died about 18 years ago now. And she was very much a New Age spiritual healer. She wrote loads and loads of books with names like Mind Waves and Mind to Mind and Mind Energy. Because, again, she was one of those people who knew a winning formula when she saw it. And she sort of introduced him to the idea of cosmic masters, that there were spiritual, astral, possibly extraterrestrial beings that were guiding the evolution of the human race and who were behind history. And on the other hand, there's also the Lucifer consciousness, the sort of dark side of that, who's causing discord. The Truth Vibrations then is a book that is, well, I hesitate to call it boilerplate New Age, but it is a very New Age movement book. It is from the history of the New Age movement. It is to the New Age movement what something like Answers in Genesis is to evangelical Christianity. You know, is the 6-day creationist version of the New Age movement. And he goes through this, and it's full of New Age takes on things, and it's full of the worst New Age takes on things. Right, okay, you cannot stress enough how terrible his New Age takes are. For instance, most often the souls of cot death babies are spiritual teachers who leave the body soon after birth to present the parents with the challenge to overcome the agony of losing a child. Your cot death baby wasn't actually a real baby, it was just pretending to be in order to teach you what it was like to be miserable and grieving. Fuck you, David Icke. Seriously. Now, you got to bear in mind that he's being laughed at, and shortly after the Wogan thing, or within a month of the Wogan thing, there's a news story in, I think, the Times about how a group of youths started parking outside his house and regularly chanting, "Give us a sign, David Icke." But he starts writing, and he writes a whole bunch of New Age books. So he's got Truth Vibrations in 1990. And the main thing in Truth Vibrations is essentially he's been given a prophecy from the cosmic masters that there's going to be a worldwide catastrophe, and that the Western world particularly will be shaken by earthquakes and floods before the end of 1991. Okay, he follows that up with Love Changes Everything. He follows that up with a book called Days of Decision. And he follows that up with a book called Heal the World, which is about as new age as you can possibly imagine. And all of these books includes pretty much the same things, banging on and on. He's got prophecies. He talks about cosmic ethereal masters. And he talks about the history of the world, 12,000 years of human history, he says, which started in Atlantis. And his version of Atlantis is actually part of a hoary New Age tradition that goes back to Madame Blavatsky, because everything New Age and occult goes back to Madame Blavatsky. This woman with the creepy eyes is the bottleneck through which all occult thinking goes through. She's pretty much the foundation of the New Age movement. And the New Age movement either follows Blavatsky, builds on Blavatsky, or departs from Blavatsky. Okay. She is one of my favorite psychic charlatans. She was totally caught faking, but also had the absolute chutzpah to be able to completely shake off the allegations. And so she wrote several books as well. The main thing is one that's important is The Secret Doctrine, and this is only half of The Secret Doctrine. It's only the second 900 pages of it. It's my copy. It's the bit that includes the history of the human race and Atlantis, and all of this is taken from David Icke has taken this from The Secret Doctrine, or rather he's taken it from people who've taken it from The Secret Doctrine. But The Secret Doctrine plagiarizes lots of other stuff. It plagiarizes the Vedas. You got the Rig Veda and the Sama Veda, and she sort of mashes them together and creates the Darth Vader. I think I've used that joke before. I'm sorry. She also plagiarizes novelists. So she talks about Lord Lytton, and she talks about the power of Vril, the sort of life force that the people of Atlantis could manipulate. And Lord Lytton invented that in his book, The Coming Race, which is a sort of like god-awful racist occult fantasy. And Icke also draws from the work of Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner was a follower of Blavatsky, who then departed from Blavatsky. He wrote a book about Atlantis and Lemuria, and I did a whole talk about Atlantis and Lemuria. It's on my Patreon if you're interested. And he did this whole book about Atlantis and Lemuria, of which I have 2 copies, because I'm that sort of person, and this is one of my copies. This is my favorite one, because I have a favorite copy of Cosmic Memory. I'm that sort of person. Icke also talks at great length about the work of Colonel James Churchward, and Churchward wrote several books about the lost continent that he called Mu, which occultists have long since conflated with Lemuria. It was supposed to be a lost land in the Pacific. And Churchward's shtick was that he got untranslated Mayan tablets and claimed to have translated them to tell the story of this lost continent from eons ago. And he said they were in a language called Narkal, but Narkal doesn't exist. And, you know, after he died, the tablets were in fact translated, and they're about nothing of the sort. But, you know, several books about Mu. So here's my copy of The Lost Continent of Mu, and it's bonkers. It's absolutely, yeah, it's nuts. Icke also draws from the work and mentions Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, who was the king of past life regression therapy in the 1930s and 40s. And Cayce too has a whole set of prophecies on Atlantis. The Atlantis stuff draws into New Age thinking. I have several books by Murray Hope, and Murray Hope, Atlantis, Myth or reality? I love question titles because the answer is myth. Duh, don't need the book. The one on the right, though, Ancient Egypt, the Sirius connection, is particularly interesting because that's about a race of extraterrestrial cosmic masters coming down to Earth and founding human civilization and guiding human evolution. And in her book, they're cat people, but essentially it's in New Age thinking. I don't know if Icke had read anything by Murray Hope. She's certainly not one of the people he mentions, but she's drawing from the same well. This is from the same milieu that the truth vibrations comes from. It's from the same world. It's the same sort of section. By the way, the one in the middle teaches you Atlantean spells, a whole Atlantean rituals you can do. They're rubbish. Anyway, but things started, they're not working for David Icke. So shortly after the Wogan interview, the Green Party, whose credibility was entirely destroyed and would remain in the dumps for a good 20 years, give or take, fired him as a spokesman. It was a bit too late, but what could they do? He basically cratered them for a generation. You had people laughing at him in the street and going, "You're a nutty." You have to bear in mind that a quarter of the British population watched Terry Wogan gently poke fun at him and let him tie his own noose for a whole 14 and a half minutes. There's 14 minutes that interview. Someone's put a YouTube a VHS recording of it on YouTube, so you can find it. But it's one of the most excruciating public suicides in career terms you can imagine. But he started writing other books now. So he keeps writing books, partly because he doesn't have much else to do. So in 1994, he writes a book called The Robots' Rebellion, and this is very different from the books he's hitherto written. He follows that up in 1995 with And the Truth Shall Set You Free. In 1996, he writes I Am Me, I Am Free, and in 1999, he writes The Biggest Secret. And they're different. They are very different. In some ways, it seems that he's taken a 180. Now, the one person who really took David Icke seriously and has actually done any kind of serious writing about him is John Ronson, who's a British journalist who writes about weird beliefs and offbeat stuff and social stuff. And in his book, Them, Adventures with Extremists, there's a chapter about him spending time with David Icke and the question of whether David Icke is, in fact, an anti-Semite is raised and gone into in some detail. But Ronson says this: in the aftermath of the Wogan show, David told me he exiled himself from Britain. He took to traveling in the United States and South Africa, countries that knew nothing about his predictions. I realized, what with all the laughter and all the ridicule, was just how easy it is to get vast numbers of people to believe anything. You just have to print it in enough newspapers. So I started to look into who was in a position to orchestrate this kind of global manipulation. And that's how I learned about the Bilderberg group. If you're at all familiar with conspiracy law, the Bilderberg group is supposed to be a group of the Bilderberg group are an informal group of international politicians who meet a couple of times a year to organize economic policies across the world. And that's a thing, right? They are a conspiracy, but they're just like a kind of common or garden bankers talking about economics conspiracy. The conspiracy law suggests that in fact they're sacrificing children and they're kind of, you know, doing all kinds of like black magic rites in the place where they meet, which is called Bohemian Grove, and all of those things. And like, you know, conspiracy law is quite specific about how he's got some serious stories. You just need to put in Bilderberg Group into Google, and holy crap. He spent 4 years being laughed at. He's committed career suicide. He's been kicked out of the Green Party. And what seems to have happened is that he seems to have been embittered a bit, but also he started to think, it's clearly not my fault. So clearly there must be a conspiracy of people against me, trying to stop me telling the truth. In The Robots' Rebellion, he says, we're talking here of the most monumental contrick in the history of the human race. A sleight of hand and mind that involves not only people, but other areas of the universe too. It has been a piece of black magic so successful that it has programmed the minds of billions of people to forget who they are, where they came from, and what they are doing today. At some point between 1991 and 1994, Icke decided that the cosmic masters were in fact malevolent, that they were responsible for guiding the evolution of the human race in a negative way. And he came to that conclusion because the world is clearly a bit shit. And that's kind of, yeah. Anyway, so he says this, and it doesn't go down well, because in The Robots' Rebellion, it's the first one where he starts raising the question of things like the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. That doesn't go well for him either. The publishers of my early books refused to even contemplate this one because of the names it named, and because the agenda for global dictatorship that it reveals was far beyond the absorption or credibility threshold of their New Age minds. The horizon was filled with disappearing backsides and clouds of dust, and for all I know, they may still be running. And that's the introduction to a second edition of the book And the Truth Shall Set You Free, which is the book that Alice Walker recommended. One of the main things the book And the Truth Shall Set You Free brings to the table is the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And this is the content. The protocols of the learned elders of Zion is notionally supposed to be it's supposed to be the minutes of a meeting of evil Jewish leaders who are in a conspiracy to control the world and make it shit for white people. It's a Russian hoax. It was made by a Russian anti-Semite in 1903. It's manifestly, ridiculously silly. It's just the fact that like the Nazis would publish it as fact. The reason, in fact, that it has traction in English is because of Henry Ford. That Henry Ford. And he's, you know, the car guy who was, of course, a terrible, terrible anti-Semite and a big fan of Mr. Hitler. And Hitler was a fan of Mr. Ford. And Henry Ford propagated it. So, you know, Henry Ford's kind of behind it. Anyway, so in these books, what's happened is that David Icke has done a 180. He's abandoned the New Age movement. He repudiates the New Age movement. He says the New Age movement is terrible, and it's because, you know, they're a tool as well of these consciousnesses, these extraterrestrial consciousnesses that are controlling us. He says that the protocols of the elders of Zion is actually not written by Jews. It was written by aliens. pretending to be Jews, and that the real hoax is that it's made in order to make people hate and fear Jews rather than lizards, which is what they should be afraid of. He kind of ruins it by, unfortunately, then uncritically repeating loads of anti-Semitic talking points while he's talking about the Protocols of Elders of Zion and quoting it uncritically throughout the book. But over the course of the next few years, he starts adopting, and indeed over the next 20 years, his conspiracy, his all-encompassing conspiracy that evil extraterrestrials have been controlling the earth in the form of shape-shifting lizards who are interbreeding with rich people, so that, like, there's a certain kind of rich and powerful person who are part of a different bloodline, and that the Rothschilds and Hitler and Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein and all these people were in fact lizards. But just give you a rundown. The thing is, right, I could pull his conspiracy theories apart. I would be here all week, okay? Seriously, because let's have a look at some of the conspiracy theories David Icke synthesizes into his worldview. So these include the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, partial Holocaust denial, the faked moon landing, the Illuminati, as I've said, 9/11 false flags, Hitler was a Rothschild, Hitler was a powerful Jewish banker, apparently, Atlantis, gotta love Atlantis, the Bilderberg Group, the Knights Templar, he's into the Knights Templar, the one about Muhammad being abducted by aliens who operated on his brain and controlled him with brain implants to make him write the Quran so it would fuck up the human race. You know, it might be arguable whether he's actually really an anti-Semite, but he's definitely an Islamophobe. Aliens building pyramids, because of course aliens built the pyramids, right? And of course, all of this is because extraterrestrial lizard people have ruled Earth for thousands of years. But not just extraterrestrial lizard people. It's not just the reptoids. It's also the Greys and the Nordics as well. Okay, there's different bloodlines. You know, it's kind of important. You've got to be quite specific. People fixate on the lizards, but there's also Greys. Although the Greys might actually be helmets for lizard people or something. Anyway, so he then talks about the ways in which the Illuminati, the lizard people, rule us. And their tools of control include the BBC, teachers, communism, banks, the prison religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of them are religions that he absolutely loathes, and he calls them the prison religions. The New Age movement is now an Illuminati tool of control. But so is the Church of the Latter-day Saints. The Anti-Defamation League. And also social welfare, welfare state. That's a way for the Illuminati to control us. And you can sort of see where he's going politically now. But, you know, I'm not done. There's more, because they also control us with aspartame, which is a mind control drug. Did you know that? Sweet eggs, mind control drug. Trans rights is a trick by the Illuminati to control the human race. Black Lives Matter is too. 9/11 was, obviously, and so is the AIDS hoax. Okay, because HIV and AIDS are not related, apparently. AIDS is apparently made in a lab. The Holocaust industry. The idea that, in fact, actually the Holocaust is he doesn't deny that the Holocaust happens. He just says it didn't happen the way that people say it happened. He says that the we've had Black Lives Matter, important enough to include twice. The Anti-Nazi League were a tool of control, apparently. 5G is a tool of control. And most recently, although 5G is pretty recent, more recent still, COVID-19. And it's his belief that COVID-19 is a tool of control and not real, and that wearing masks is just a way to get people not to connect with each other anymore. That got him kicked off YouTube and Facebook, but not Twitter just yet. So the central book in his most recent series of books is called Children of the Matrix, and this is the one which has got the reptoids in great detail, and Atlantis and Lemuria and all this other stuff. And as you see, it's been republished. I've got a 2017 edition of it, and you can also see that I had a lot of material in this book. This is basically the thing about David Icke's books since 1994. You don't need to read more than one of them. I know I've read 4 of them, but you don't need to read more than one, because they just rehash the same talking points over and over and over. And as time goes on, they add new stuff, okay, but the central thesis is the same. So from Children of the Matrix in 2001, we've got Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster in 2002. So he went straight in there and said, the World Trade Center is all a false flag, it's all false, it's a controlled detonation. Tales from the Time Loop in 2003. Infinite Love is the Only Truth in 2005. 2007, the David Icke Guide to the Global Conspiracy. You can't make this up. 2010, Human Race, Get Off Your Knees. 2012, Remember Who You Are. 2013, The Perception Deception, or It's All Bollocks. 2016, The Phantom Self. 2017, Everything You Need to Know But Have Never Been Told. And in 2019, The Trigger, The Lie That Changed the World. If you look at his Twitter, right, it just goes all sorts of places. I spent half an hour on his Twitter today, and I got, remember, this is what all started it all, based on a lie. He doesn't believe that planes hit the World Trade Center. He said there were no planes, that it was a controlled explosion, and that they were blown up from below. The simple fact that he says they were blown up from below, and actually if you look at where the explosion and the flames are here, yeah. Okay, white people are all privileged racists, and it's not racist to say so because I'm woke, and woke can't be racist. He's being sarcastic. He's like going, and he doesn't get it. He doesn't get what racism is. He doesn't understand it. Which you can tell when you look at this. Black lives, and he's crossed out, matter and written, manipulated. See its funders, Soros, 1% billionaires, 1% corporations, 1% foundations. They care about black people. They are using race to divide and rule the people of all races for their benefit. It's not a race war, it's a class war. He believes all lives matter. Yeah. I have no problem with drag queens. All the best to you. I have a problem with them being used to confuse the gender perceptions of children. He's talking about the controversy about the drag queen story time, where a drag queen was reading bedtime stories to children in a library, and essentially the TERFs got in there and essentially put a stop to that. But then you compare that to trans rights or human rights. Yes, and so is the right to have a different opinion. No, David, no, it isn't. No. Karl Popper's tolerance problem comes in here. The idea that actually, in order to be tolerant, you're not supposed to tolerate intolerance, right? It's the intolerance paradox of Karl Popper, and he's just fallen right through that hole. Not necessary before, now it is. To protect you? No, to control you. The more rules you unquestioningly follow, the more control. Bah. Yeah, he's all about sheep and sheeple. Anyone who calls people sheep or sheeple is basically an arsehole. But going back to the terrible New Age takes that we had earlier on, I think one thing is fairly certain: he's always been an arsehole, frankly. Whether or not he's an anti-Semite, surely the thing that got him pulled off Facebook was this: COVID-19. It's not a virus. It's a 5G/GE electronic battle for your soul. 5G is a lethal, untested scam to create a prison for your mind. 5G, no. The health, mental, and emotional impact will be catastrophic as planned. He's really wordy with his memes. Have you noticed? Ridiculously so. There's a certain way in which you look at things. So he started hearing voices, he started having visions, and the New Agers said to him, "You're a prophet, you're in touch with the masters." And right up until about 1999, he continually writes about channeling. And a lot of the things that he writes, he says, "My feeling is," and then says some ridiculous ahistorical nonsense. And it's because he's channeled it. It's because it's unverified personal gnosis. And because it's also bullshit, that means he can't see his gnosis in front of his feces. That sounded a lot better in my head. Anyway, the idea is, I think, that he essentially is presenting these things. He's trying desperately to get this across to you. And a lot of his symptoms, if you compared them to a list of the symptoms of fairly high functioning schizophrenia, do actually map. His writing has the queasy, circular, and obsessive quality of a schizophrenic. I am not a psychiatrist. I cannot make that call. But I know schizophrenics. I have lived with them. My mum is, I think, schizophrenic, and talks like my mum, right? He talks like someone I used to share a house with, who wound up disappearing for a week before they found her in a field looking for God. He's not well. But that not wellness leads to a kind of hardness, a kind of unwillingness to see nuance. So one of his main things, for instance, is that again and again and again, you'll have an argument like this. Why do people believe X when Y? Okay, so you're saying, why so, surely, if this is the case, why can't this be true? Okay, so for example, one of his arguments is, if a plane hit the Pentagon on 9/11, why aren't there any pictures of debris or bodies? Okay, you think, whoa, mind blown. Wow. Here's a picture of debris from the Pentagon on 9/11. And here's another one. And here's another one. And here's one that's actually got the serial number of the vehicle on it, right? But he doesn't hear that evidence. He doesn't see it. I have no doubt that when you show something from that American Airlines flight to him, he'll go, it's a fabrication, or it was staged after the fact. or it was digitally painted, or look at the light, that's not right, or look, there's digital artifacting on that picture. He won't see it. But also, he's continually going on about freedom. He's continually going on about striking out against the rulers of the world. But he includes among the rulers of the world the New Age movement, the Anti-Defamation League, the Anti-Nazi League, people in the, quote, prison religions, unquote, and Black Lives Matter. He's got an awful tendency to punch down. Now, I call this, and I came up with this myself, so I'm calling this the Hancock Effect, right? Which is, I defined as the unfailing tendency of any writer who labels themselves a free thinker to unthinkingly reify absolutely traditional ideas about human identity and opposing any challenge to their own ideas, as, you know, and opposing it as a ploy of the secret rulers of the world and of the forces above them. And obviously is very nearly always a stray white man, although Katie Hopkins exists. So yeah, and David Icke falls in. I mean, I call it the Hancock Effect because of Graham Hancock, who's like the fake archaeologist who writes horrendously racist books about how white people from Atlantis built the pyramids at Machu Picchu and stuff, because obviously those stupid brown people couldn't have done it, right? Yeah, Graham Hancock. Idiot. But this is hugely compelling. David Icke and Graham Hancock and people like them, Erich von Däniken, you know, the aliens built the pyramids guy, all these other people, they have followings. These very conservative, and they're conservative, largely white men. They may, you know, be politically odd and have offbeat ideas, but socially they are very conservative. They are essentially drag people along with them because it's like the world has always been made in their shape. They have always been the ones who have the space and the power to say this stuff because the world has given them a platform. Would people read David Icke and take him at all seriously if he didn't already have a following? Would he have had a following if he wasn't on the telly for a decade and known as a household name to everybody in the UK? And this is why it's all the more depressing with these people and how they punch down. When you see an individual who is utterly sold on what they're saying, like Alice Walker. Look, it's Alice Walker. She wrote The Color Purple. She's cuddling a tiny bird. It's Alice freaking Walker. But it's Alice Walker who writes repeatedly on her website about how great David Icke is. It's not just like one recommendation. You go to Alice Walker's website and put in a search for David Icke. There's loads of posts about it on her blog. And she wrote this poem called "It is Our Frightful Duty to Study the Talmud." And it includes this: where to start. You will find some information. And this is supposed to be a poem, right? She wrote. Did she win the Nobel Prize? I don't know. She's won, Pulitzer Prize and all sorts of things. But you'll find some information slightly, unfortunately, by Googling. For a more in-depth study, I recommend starting with YouTube. Simply follow the trail of the Talmud as his poison belatedly winds its way into our collective unconsciousness. And then you go down. But hang in there, checking and double checking, listening to everybody, even the teachers with the twisted pasts that scare you the most, and the taped rants of outraged citizens that sound like madcap characters on Car Talk, except they are not laughing, they're righteously outraged. And then at the bottom, are Goyim, parenthesis us, meant to be slaves of Jews, and not only that, but to enjoy it. Are 3-year-old and a day girls eligible for marriage and intercourse? Are young boys fair game for rape? Might even the best of the Goyim must again be killed? Pause a moment and think what this could mean or already has meant, apart from the fact that that is a god-awful poem. What is wrong with you, Alice Walker? It seems to be the first-person account of someone who has been radicalized by YouTube. The point is, it's really easy if you watch enough stuff on YouTube and that's all you watch, for it to change it. You hear the stories about people whose minds have been turned into something completely different by Fox News. Just watching Fox News, you get people turned from like nice people into like frothing Nazis by Fox News, and that sort of thing. And you have this man who really does believe and hate lizards, but the problem is that the lizards have made him racist. They've made him an anti-Semite. Because it's possible not to be personally hateful towards people and still propagate the structures that hurt people. That is literally what racism is. And he doesn't understand it because he is for all the fact that he has wacky ideas, really not progressive in any kind of way. He really isn't a free thinker at all. And in fact, he supports the very structures that he claims to be fighting against. And I find that kind of tragic. I find that kind of, it's a bleak paradox that he has so much traction, that he's so well known, but he comes from somewhere. He's a product of our society. In a lot of ways, he is the conspiracy theorist that we created, and the conspiracy theorist we deserve.